In this lecture, we're going to begin looking at the executive branch in more detail. Before we get started, things to remember. One, we've already started looking at the executive branch, specifically the presidency. And so remember your work in your introductory assignment, how the executive was designed to overcome problems that the Articles of Confederation government was experiencing, why designing the executive was challenging, especially thinking in terms of lack of other examples in the world to borrow from when designing our own executive branch, the framers' concerns of an overstrong executive, and so trying to find that balance between an executive that was strong enough to correct from the Articles of Confederation's weaknesses while avoiding an overly strong executive that would become a kind of elective monarch. And especially as we think about this, remember, Federalist 70 is going to be key for those students who are watching this who will be preparing for the AP exam. Federalist 70 is one of your required documents. And also connect this to things we've been learning about off and on for most of the year. Separation of powers, checks and balances, SOP and CAB. Also remember, again, going back to earlier learning, that our executive branch works as part of a federal government that has, relative to the states, become much more powerful over time. And also, U9, for now, our focus is going to be on the president. We will be talking about things like the bureaucracy, but we will have a more specific focus on the bureaucracy later. To start, let's look at what it takes to become the president of the United States. And in terms of formal qualifications, there aren't that many. You have to be 35 years old, which is not old by today's standards, but at that time, somebody who'd reached the age of 35 was assumed to have some life experience, maturity, and still be vigorous for the job. You had to be a native-born citizen, so you could not come here from another country, obtain citizenship, and run for president. I mean, this is something that was talked about quite a while ago when Arnold Schwarzenegger was a rising star, perhaps within the Republican Party. Some people thought he would make a good president, but I realized that he would not be able to do this because he had been born in Austria and become a citizen later. So he could be governor of California, but not president of the United States. And you must have been someone who had resided in the United States for 14 years prior to becoming president. Now, if the formal qualifications list is quite short in terms of informal qualifications, I mean, if we look at some of the background of presidents, once we get past the early years, if you notice that a background in law is often very important. Lots of lawyers through here. Also, people who'd made their career in the military. Now, that doesn't show up necessarily as much on this list. But we do have military heroes, Ulysses Grant, Dwight Eisenhower. These were people, William Harrison, also going back there, but military career was important in his run for the presidency. Look also in terms of education. Lots of people who obtained their education in prestigious institutions. Not universal, and not all of them went to college. But, I mean, especially early on, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren. On down the list, we've got some, including Grover Cleveland, right until now. With Trump's second administration, the only president to have served 2 non-consecutive terms. But after Harry Truman, there are no more presidents who lack a college education. And lots of those are at pretty prestigious places. Also, if we look, quite a few presidents have served terms as governor in the past or been in Congress. So some previous experience either in the federal government, often a longer service in the federal government. LBJ, he had been someone who made a career in Congress. Same with Jerry Ford, although of course he was never elected president. Despite serving as president, he was never even elected as vice president. But long service in Congress historically or statewide office has been something that is important. More recently, that perhaps there's been a shift in that. Donald Trump had never served in elected office before running for and being elected as president. And Barack Obama had a really pretty short career in elected politics before becoming president. It was a first-term senator, did not complete the first term in the Senate before becoming president. But then still, this list, as you can tell, it kind of runs out. Like George W. Bush is the last one on it. So talking about Trump and Obama, they're not on here. But if you look at Biden, right, Biden was somebody who had had a long career in the Senate. So there are some informal qualifications. Also, if you notice, most of these presidents are also rather older than the minimum requirement of 35. Salary and benefits, this is just to give you some sense. The president is paid $400,000 a year taxed. This is, I know it sounds like a lot of money. I would love to have $400,000 a year, but considering the importance of the job and what we hope we get out of the person who performs it, $400K is not a lot of money, and it has lagged significantly behind the times in terms of what presidents used to make relative to what was a lot of money. Presidents also get $100,000 a year in travel expenses. Presidents do travel a lot of times on official U.S. business, but also they do get vacations. $50,000 a year for expenses, other expenses. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on these in great detail. I just want you to get a sense of what a president gets back. $19,000 a year for entertainment. Yeah, presidents take vacations with their families. Yeah, there are also other perks. Of course, you get to live in the White House. And you get to be carted around on Air Force One. Yeah, you get Secret Service protection for life. Actually, I'm not entirely sure how much that is seen as a perk. I think a lot of people, especially the families of presidents, kind of chafe under never being able to go somewhere without Secret Service protection. Some of the perks really kick in right after leaving office. A lot of presidents become wealthy not because of the money they made as president, but because they are able to make a lot of money after they leave office writing books about their time in office or about their lives, or at least having a ghostwriter write those books for them. And then they make a lot of money. They get paid a lot of money to go to speaking engagements. So there are definitely a lot of perks to being president. You also get to be known as the most powerful person on earth, the leader of the free world. And I suppose those could probably massage one's ego a bit in the right direction. On to the role of the president. Some of these things we know. The president is chief of state, right? Which also means they're the head of state. So in a country like Britain, the chief of state or head of state would be the monarch, the king or the queen. In a place like Germany, it is a president, or Finland, it's a president who serves a more ceremonial role as kind of the face of national unity. Going along with this, especially for our president, this is not something that would apply everywhere. President is the chief diplomat of the United States. They have the power of recognizing countries. And I don't mean being able to pick them out from a map. That helps, but it's not what I'm talking about. They get to say the United States recognizes this country as a sovereign state entitled to the legal equality, or entitled to legal equality with all other states. They do this by accepting diplomats from those countries. And that can be enough. These are not always big countries. There aren't that many places on Earth, big patches of territory, that are not occupied by something that has been recognized as a state for some time. Bush recognized Kosovo, a very small state in the Balkans region, Southern Europe. Obama recognized South Sudan after it split from Sudan. Biden, these not all big places, Cook Islands and Niue. Not sure I'm pronouncing that one correctly. Probably should have looked at that before starting this lecture. My apologies to anybody who happens to be from that tiny island group. And then there's a question of, will Trump recognize Somaliland? If you hear Somaliland and think of Somalia, you're on the right track. It is technically part of Somalia. If you think of Somalia as kind of this chaotic, largely out of control country, right, at times in my life, the government of Somalia has only been able to control a few blocks of territory in the capital of Mogadishu, and only then because of the presence of UN peacekeepers. You may have seen the movie Black Hawk Down. That is not Somaliland. Somaliland has been a part of that country this whole time, but it has been autonomous. It has kind of kept itself apart administratively and politically. It has run its own thing, and it has been kind of this very stable part of Somalia where things go reasonably well. And so there's a question of, will Trump recognize Somaliland as an independent sovereign state? Treaties. The president gets to make treaties, negotiate treaties with other countries. Those are subject to Senate advice and consent. It requires 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify a treaty. Partly for this reason, in their role as chief diplomat, presidents have increasingly used executive agreements. And you can think of these as treaty light. Not too light, though. They do have the force of law for the United States. They are used for important things. And while they do have legal force, they do lack that treaty status. So their legal status is not as strong. Though again, in practice, they do have legal status. They are binding on the United States, but they are less permanent. They can be made and broken from one presidential administration to the next. And a good example of this is the Paris Climate Agreement. Obama put the United States in. Trump pulled the United States out. Biden put the United States back in. Trump pulled the United States back out. So executive agreements, again, are used for important things. They are in practice binding, but they have far less permanence than a treaty that had been negotiated by a president, administration, and ratified by the Senate. The president is also, of course, the chief executive, which means they are the head of government. In other countries, let's use our examples of Britain and Germany again, those would be the prime ministers. We're going to talk much more about the president's role as head of government, the chief executive, so for now we are going to leave it at that. The president is also the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. this is an important thing, that we have civilian control of the military. That has been a problem for a lot of countries, where the military ends up being in control of the civil government, not the other way around. Presidents have wide latitude, as we're going to see and have already seen to some extent, this go to use U.S. forces. You've seen that just within Trump's second administration. Of course, there are lots of other examples of this in other administrations. The strikes on boats coming out of Venezuela, some also on the Pacific side of the Americas. Strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, strikes in Syria, lots of examples of this. However, remember, presidents do not get to declare war, and wars can only be declared by Congress. The president is also chief legislator. Now, we put this in quotation marks because, of course, the president is the head of the executive branch, not part of the legislative branch, but they do have important legislative functions. One of those we know about is the veto power, constitutional power to reject laws signed by or passed by Congress. The president also proposes the budget, which, especially today, is one of the key legislative programs that will go through Congress, and that is proposed in appropriations requests packaged together as the federal budget by the president's administration. The president is also chief legislator in the sense that they set the legislative agenda. The budget itself is a huge part of the agenda. President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I call it his act. Of course, it only becomes an act after being passed through Congress. That was huge for setting his agenda in terms of taxing and spending, of course, but also things like funding for his immigration policies. We also saw, to back up to that again, when we looked at the comparison of the use of the discharge petition in the 73rd and 119th Congress, that Speaker Rainey in the 73rd Congress was very focused on passing the legislation that would enact the policy priorities of Franklin Roosevelt. And so even outside of just the budget, the president plays, historically and now, a very large role in setting the legislative agenda. They also do this through the State of the Union address. They use this to talk about achievements they have made, either on their own or in partnership with Congress to pass legislation. They lay out their priorities, the things they want to enact in the next year, often through legislation. And of course, more broadly, there's the bully pulpit. Presidents have lots of opportunities to get lots of attention, calling for legislative action that they would like to see. Presidents are also the leader of their party. The party that is out of power in the presidency, they have to pick somebody else to kind of be the face of the party. Sometimes they don't really have a clear one, but presidents in practice are the leaders of their parties. They're the highest elected official within their party. They have that bully pulpit. They are the party leader. Term of office, a lot of this we know, some of this you've seen in your introductory work. Presidents serve a 4-year term. Washington set the precedent. It's underlined for a reason. That was important in your introductory work. We have two kinds of ways of thinking about precedent. One we'll spend more time on later. That's legal precedent. That is a different thing. Here, in terms of precedent, we're talking about setting the precedent of a tradition. And Washington set that tradition, that precedent of 2 terms. And that lasted all the way down in practice to Franklin Roosevelt, who served 3 straight terms and part of a 4th. And that broke the tradition. understand the importance of precedent and tradition, that two-term precedent was then formalized in the 22nd Amendment. Technically, however, I do want you to understand that a person could serve, if all the stars aligned just right, a person could serve for 10 years. If they were the vice president and the president died or became incapable of continuing their term, right, at the halfway point with 2 years remaining, and the vice president could assume the presidency, serve out the remaining 2 years of that term, and have two whole terms of their own if they were elected. So technically you can get 10 years in the White House. Also, this may fall more into the realm of trivia than things you really need to know, but Grover Cleveland, and here, I guess I've not introduced those. I don't think I needed to introduce Washington, Roosevelt. Grover Cleveland, served 2 non-consecutive terms. It was one of the things that he was perhaps best known for down to the present time. Of course, now Trump has joined that exclusive club by serving himself 2 non-consecutive terms. Now, in terms of somebody not being president, one of the things that can take a president out is being removed from office by impeachment. Impeachment itself, we talk about the impeachment process. Impeachment is the accusation of misconduct, right, being charged with a high crime or misdemeanor, to use the language of the Constitution. Of course, also in there, these usually don't get labeled into it because we haven't really had cases where presidents have been charged with treason or bribery. That's in Article 2, Section 4. The impeachment process, we have stuff from Article 2 and Article 1 here. Remember, I've seen this before, but I want it to be burned into your brains. The House charges or impeaches. That requires a simple majority vote in the House. The trial occurs in the Senate. The Senate serves as the jury. If the president is on trial, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides as the judge. If there is a conviction, then the president is removed from office and disqualified from holding office in future. But remember, to convict a president, you need 2/3 vote in the House, in the Senate. Impeachment itself, the bar of a simple majority is not that high, but we've still only had 3 presidents who have been impeached. Andrew Johnson in 1867, Bill Clinton in 2000, Donald Trump impeached twice, 2019 and again in 2021, both of those, of course, being in his first term. We had the near miss. Sometimes when students can't remember which was the president that would have been impeached but wasn't, or likely would have been impeached but wasn't. Nixon's the one. It's unfortunate campaign advertising there, but it works to help students remember. Impeachment proceedings were in progress, but he resigned before he could be charged in the House. And I know we're kind of jumping from one topic to another. Before we get to that, since I had misspoken there, I do want to make sure that you've got in your notes, right, simple majority in the House to impeach or charge. The Senate, right, conviction in the Senate requires a 2/3 supermajority. Presidential amendments. We have the 12th Amendment in 1804, and we call these presidential amendments because they have something that impacts very much on the presidency. After this, because of some of the problems that had taken place in our earliest presidential elections, the vice president was no longer simply the person who was the second place candidate in the presidential election. This very quickly leads to the practice of the president and vice president running together on a single ticket, as we can see in this case of James K. Polk's run for president, right, with a running mate on the same ticket. The 20th, this is really, it's an amendment, but its impact for us is procedural. In 1933, the inauguration is moved from March to January. Now, if that seems like a minor thing to have an amendment about, 1933, not really a coincidence. I mean, some of this was seen as a need to address the potential urgent things awaiting a new president and the desire of the country to get that new president into office and enacting their policy program more quickly. As of 1933, of course, that is when Franklin Roosevelt is coming into office during the Great Depression. The outgoing president, Herbert Hoover, is very unpopular. People want that change of president, that change of policy more quickly. So we move up the inauguration from March to January. We've already talked a bit about the 22nd Amendment, 1951. It limits the president to 2 terms. Again, with the possibility of 2.5 terms or 10 years for a president by succession. 25th Amendment, this is another one that we have not talked about. This deals with presidential disability and the succession. Of course, vice president is number 1 in succession. It's very easy for people to think they're number 2. And I don't know that that's necessarily a slip up that's going to get you into trouble on a test, although I'll probably quiz you about it just to make sure that nobody else can trip you up. So vice president is first in line for succession. If there is no vice president, then the president appoints a replacement who will be confirmed by Congress. This requires majority votes in both the House and the Senate. In terms of presidential disability, the president can declare themselves unable to discharge the powers and duties of their office. And this has happened. George W. Bush, you may think I'm making this up. And I mean, there's nothing bad about it, but it may sound like I'm making it up. A man of his age, and it was time for a colonoscopy. He was going to be put under general anesthetic, so he would not have to actually experience the colonoscopy. Of course, under general anesthetic, the president is not able to discharge the power and duties of his office, and so he declared that he would be unable to do the job, and Vice President Cheney assumed the functions of the president for that short period of time. However, it is possible that a president would be unable to discharge the power and duties of the office due to medical emergency, mental health crisis, and at that point, the vice president and a majority of the president's cabinet, will meet those cabinet people soon, can make that declaration and have the vice president assume the authorities of the president. More on the presidential succession. And this is, of course, not an amendment. This is legislation. The Presidential Succession Act of 1947. Again, we've got reinforcement. Vice president is first in the order of succession. Also serve as president of the Senate. It's a good time to remind you of that. From there goes to the Speaker of the House. And remember that this is not an accident. The Speaker of the House is the leader, right, chosen by a majority of the members of the House, and the House is in turn the part of the elected federal government that is the most responsive, or should be the most responsive, to the people. Because they're elected every 2 years, they are elected district by district. And so the Speaker is second in the order of succession. From there it goes to whoever the President pro tem is in, or pro tempore is in the Senate. From there, Secretary of State, and through the remaining cabinet members. We're not going to go through the order. I don't remember it. you don't need to. This is a case where we are certainly not firefighters. We have time to look it up if we ever do need to know. Though if you do want it, there is an image of that. You can pause and peruse it to your heart's content. Okay. All right. We do also have, just for brief, again, more trivial pursuit kind of knowledge than anything else, we do have presidents who've had incomplete terms. Some of them due to assassination. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Harding. Actually, as you can tell, a fair bit of assassinations. Most famous of those being Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, and Richard Nixon, of course, resigning after the Watergate scandal that I hope you learned about in your U.S. history class last year. Continuing with presidential responsibilities, we've already seen some of the legislative ones. And again, we've kind of already hinted at some of these powers of the presidency, just in talking about kind of their big picture roles. But here we'll be a bit more specific. Of course, as the chief executive, the head of government, the president's job is to faithfully execute the laws passed by Congress, and in most cases also signed into law by the presidency. We'll understand why that is in most cases. Military, remember, the president is the commander-in-chief. And this is one of those powers that I know we have already talked about. It's good to have this in a couple of places. The president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but Congress must declare war, and it doesn't happen very often. The last time the United States declared war was in 1942 against some of the smaller Axis powers in, I believe all of them were in Eastern Europe. Relevant to this is the War Powers Act of 1973. This is an example of something that became law despite not being signed by the president. Congress overrode his veto on that. And according to this act, presidents are supposed to consult Congress, if at all possible, before involving the United States in military operations. At the very least, presidents are required by the act to report their use of the military to Congress within 2 days, 48 hours of that use of force. And if troops are involved in that, they must be removed from that engagement after 60 days unless Congress gives approval for continued hostilities. In practice, this has not been effective. I mean, obviously, presidents didn't want it. President Nixon vetoed it. Congress overrode that veto. Presidents have at least stuck to this part of reporting their use of the military, but presidents consider this to be an unconstitutional encroachment on their power. And they've also found workarounds to essentially allow them to circumvent, especially the limit on keeping troops engaged in hostility past that 60-day limit. We also know the president has appointment powers and fill executive positions, members of the cabinet, for example. We'll meet the cabinet in a bit. Judges, federal judges, up to and, of course, including the Supreme Court. But for these with Senate approval, which as we've seen before, is majority votes for executive and judicial appointments. And this is another one of those powers that we've already seen some of these. The president gets to make treaties for those to be ratified. We need 2/3 of Senate approval. That's why we have far more executive agreements than treaties. And then, of course, there's the veto, which we've mentioned, but let's talk about it here explicitly. This is when the president rejects a bill. This is something, as we have just seen with the case of the War Powers Act 1973, that can be overridden by 2/3 supermajorities in the House and Senate. which is a high bar, but can be done, obviously. The pocket veto, this is kind of an odd beast. If a president, for some reason, does not want a bill, but does not want to explicitly reject it, and that could be for a variety of reasons, they can simply hold on to it, and if Congress adjourns within 10 days of the president just sitting on that bill, then it dies. So if Congress is not in session and the president hasn't signed it after 10 days, it dies. However, if Congress is still in session, then the president does not sign the law, but it becomes does not sign the bill, but it becomes law anyway. As the key here for that 10-day window is whether Congress is adjourned or is still in session. If they've adjourned, the bill dies by pocket veto. If they are in session, it becomes a law without the president's signature. There's also the pardon, and this is kind of official forgiveness for crimes. No, there are limits to this. Not a whole lot. I mean, in a lot of ways. I mean, presidents can use that power very widely. We've seen that in the second Trump administration with the pardoning of people who were involved in the January 6th attack on the Capitol building, which, depending on who you ask, was or was not an insurrection. Presidents cannot pardon themselves. They can pardon other presidents. One of the most famous pardons was the Nixon pardon. So Gerald Ford becomes president through a strange route. Spiro Agnew had been Nixon's vice president. So here what we're also talking about comes in with the 25th Amendment and the Succession Act. Spiro Agnew was Nixon's vice president. He got caught up in his own scandal and resigned from office. Nixon appointed Gerald Ford from the House to become the new vice president. And of course, when Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes the president. He ends up picking his own vice president, but that's not really the key to the story here. Gerald Ford famously, and to his own personal damage as president, and just for himself, pardoned Nixon in his mind to kind of move the country past that crisis so that we could do other things. Also, at this point, I do want to point out for whatever reason, this turkey has over the years, I mean, you can tell over the years, this is getting older, and its feathers have turned white. Presidents have serially pardoned this turkey. I don't know what the turkey has done, but I mean, I think this is one of the most publicized annual pardons. I think this bird's street name is Butterballer Shot Collar. Pretty sure. I mean, you guys can check me on that. You guys know I'm old and not as in touch with what's going on out in the streets. But the pardon power. And of course, that's on there twice. Okay, should not have been on there twice. Continuing. Executive orders. This is something we will spend some more time on in the next lecture. These are presidential orders that they are, of course, not laws. They are simply made by the president, but they have the power of law. And they've been used for important things. Truman used them to desegregate the military. Lincoln, of course, had used them earlier for the Emancipation Proclamation. Things that would be more on your radar in the current time. Trump renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America by executive order. Changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Now, that is still, by law, the name of that department is still the Department of Defense. So this is not totally resolved. Aside from these high-profile things, executive orders are kind of the president's way of controlling the federal bureaucracy, okay, telling the bureaucracy what he wants it to do. There's also executive privilege. This is another thing we will talk about again in more detail in the second lecture. This is the right of the president to keep some information private, and that means especially private from Congress, to not have to reveal that. The argument is that this is part of separation of powers. The president should be able to keep some of the own workings of their administration, their government, private, to facilitate the workings of the executive branch. And so they don't have to disclose those things to Congress. That's the argument. The president can also call special sessions of Congress. So if Congress has adjourned and is not in session, under extraordinary occasions, and according to Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, the president may call them back into session. The last time this was done in 1948, and it is not really very relevant today. Congress is in session much more of the time. I mean, they have sometimes long recesses, but there is much less use for the calling of special sessions today than there would have been in the past. And when we pick up in the next lecture, we will look at the president's actual running of the government. And this is going to be the fun stuff. And you can maybe detect my facetiousness there. The cabinet, White House Executive Office of the President, those kinds of things.